let's see an example of this productive data filter as implemented by the tolerance principle in action. So we're going to consider a syllabic word form where you have a short syllable, short vowel syllable for the first one, so or ki or and uh-oh, and a long vowel syllable for the second one, way, t-o, right? So way, kitty, uh-oh, these are three different stress contours for the same syllabic word form. Okay. So let's consider the two parametric system, the HV versus the Hayes. And what we see here is that in the acquisitional intake, there are 162 types of this one and 3,700 some tokens. So this means that there are specific instances, like almost like vocabulary items of this type, and of those words, they appear this many times. So away would be an example of this type, and away appearing, I don't know, 300 times would be 300 tokens of that one type. So type sort of gets rid of any frequency effects and is really just talking in some sense about your vocabulary items. So let's say the ones like kitty, there are 325 like those that appear 1,200 sometimes, and let's say there are 19 like uh-oh that appear 1,500 times, right? So these are your words, and these are how frequently they appear. Now, the tolerance principle, actually, let's sort of walk through which ones are good or bad for each of our two possible representations. So if you look at this one, these are actually good for this English grammar representation, and they're bad for that one, okay? And then over here, these are bad for this one, but good for that one, right? So sort of opposite feelings, so to speak, from each representation. And then these are bad for both, right? So, depending on if there is a dominant pattern, which one it is, this could really affect which representations have an easier or harder time learning from these data, right? So this one's going to be hard for both. This one's going to be easier for HV. This one's going to be easier for Hayes. Okay, so what does the tolerance principle say? Now, the tolerance principle looks at the word type, so that's why these are bolded. These are the only things that matter. You don't care how frequently it occurs. You only care how many vocabulary items, right? So which word types, how many of those do you have? So you're going to look at the word types for each stress pattern, and each type represents an individual item that might follow the regular stress pattern rule, if there actually is one. So it doesn't matter how frequently a type appears, which is the tokens, right? We're just looking at the vocabulary items that have a certain stress pattern. So how many items should the stress rule apply to if it in fact exists for this word form? And the answer is you just add up all of your types, right? And this turns out to be 506. That is your N. So how many exceptions can you tolerate? Well, that divided by the natural log of that, which is around 81, right? So if you have 81 or fewer exceptions, that's fine. You can have the rule. But if you have more than 81 exceptions, it's probably not fine. You probably don't want to have a rule because there's no dominant pattern here. Let's see what we get. So let's look at these one at a time. So if we look at this one, if this is the dominant pattern, then it seems like there are too many exceptions, right? So if 162 that follow it, but 325 plus 19 exceptions, well, 325 plus 19 is definitely more than 81, right? So that can't be the dominant pattern. And let's look at this one. So if this is the dominant pattern, you still have too many exceptions, right? 162 and 19 is still greater than 81. So that's not the dominant pattern. And what about 19? Well, that's definitely not the dominant pattern, right? There are this many, which is much greater than 81, right? So in fact, none of these are the dominant pattern. There's no dominant pattern. So in fact, none of these syllable word form data should be used to learn the English grammar. You should just ignore everything because this is just a mess from your perspective using these, the level of knowledge you have at this time. Okay, so this will actually end up helping both grammars because they won't be penalized for the patterns they can't account for. So that will sort of work out well for these two representations. What about this one? So this is the optimality theory, the constraint-based representation, which means it has a slightly different definition of how many things are in these different buckets. But okay, so you have 25 of these, 316 of these, and 14 of these. And then they appear with, with whatever frequency they appear. So okay. Let's look. So it turns out that these 316 are bad for all of the variants of the English grammar that are currently proposed. So we'd actually really love to rule that one out if we can, right? Because they're bad. This one, these items are good for most of the English grammar. So remember, in these constraint-based systems, you have, sort of these rankings defined. So any grammar that obeys this ranking ordering counts as an English grammar. There are 26 of them, given the OT constraints proposed. And you know what? 21 of those actually are able to account for things like away. And then the rest of them are able to account for things like right? So, okay. Let's use our tolerance principle. How many items should the stress rule apply to? And the answer is just add up your types. And so this works out to be 355, which means the number of exceptions you can tolerate is around 60. So if you have 60 or fewer exceptions, you have a dominant pattern. You have a rule, right? You should learn from that pattern. So let's look at this one. Well, 25 means you've got a whole bunch of exceptions, definitely more than 60. That's not the dominant one. What about this one? Well, now you have 25 and 14 is less than 60. There are not too many exceptions. This looks very much like a dominant pattern, and just to affirm that, obviously this is not the dominant pattern because you have all of these would be exceptions, right? So, hey, we have a dominant pattern here. That's fantastic. But guess what? This is in fact the only one that the OT grammar couldn't account for. We have a dominant pattern. We're going to, as a learner using this kind of filter, actually pay attention to it and try to learn from it to learn the right grammar for our language. But oops, this is the only one that the English grammars can't account for. So this means the learner using the productivity filter would have actually even more trouble learning the English grammar from these data. Oops, so it goes. But the thing to keep in mind really is that using this tolerance principle, again, the goal is to learn a grammar that can account for all of the productive data, the ones that are dominant patterns for particular syllabic word forms.